Thank you. Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're calling in from today. Um, I'm really excited to have you all here. And I just see some folks with the AI note takers, which is fine. The meeting is also going to be recorded today, and we'll share it out with everyone afterwards in case other members of your team or organization aren't able to join us. So we'll just wait a few moments as folks trickle in before we get started. But I hope everyone's doing well. It's a balmy 28 degrees here in Ottawa. And it's going to feel like 45 on Monday. So I really hope that other folks across the country aren't in the same sweaty position as I am. But with that, as folks begin to trickle into the call here, just wanted to thank you all for joining us for our June Bird Friendly City Community of Practice meeting. As I mentioned, today's call will be recorded. And just as a quick reminder, please be sure to stay on mute while others are speaking. And you're more than welcome to keep your cameras on or off throughout today's call. This space is really for everyone to connect and learn from one another. If this is your first time at a bird-friendly city community of practice meeting, my name's Autumn Jordan, my pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Nature Canada Bird-Friendly City Organizer. I started at Nature Canada in May 2021 as a conservation technician working with a naturalist team on marsh monitoring of swallows and species at risk in the Dunville Marsh near Hagersville, Ontario. Um, and if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and where you're calling in from today, that would be awesome. And before we dive into today's presentation, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the existence of Canada is the direct result of colonial policies that have negatively impacted Indigenous people for hundreds of years. There are currently more than 630 First Nations communities, 53 Inuit communities, and 8 Métis settlements in the country now known as Canada, many of whom have inhabited this land since time immemorial. Indigenous nations and people from coast to coast to coast continue to play a crucial role stewarding the land and protecting the species that rely on it. At Nature Canada, we're reaffirming our commitment to amplifying the voice of Indigenous peoples as stewards and caretakers of the land, water, and the species that inhabit it. Today, I'm calling in from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, who have also lived here and nurtured this land for time immemorial. If you're not sure of your own land's history and whose land you currently reside on, I encourage you to check out native-land.org for more information, and it'll also tell you about the local traditional language spoken there too. And so with that, I'm happy to get started and introduce Dr. Brendon Samuels, who, if you don't know of yet, I'm sure you've heard of his work. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Ecological Design Lab at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University. Brendon coordinates the Bird Friendly City team for London, Ontario, recently completed his PhD at Western University studying bird glass collisions, and Brendon also works for the Fatal Light Awareness Program. I honestly don't know how Brendon does it all, but I'm very happy that he has taken the time today to share his learnings and work with us at the Ecological Design Lab to talk about bylaws for biodiversity and how your community can implement and advocate for naturalization. Thank you so much, Brendon, and I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and having me. I really always appreciate getting together with folks from bird-friendly cities and towns across Canada who share a common goal. And I'm happy to share what I've learned through my experiences and some work that's been done in the lab that I'm now part of. So I'm going to share my screen. If you guys could just give me confirmation that you can see my slides.
Yep.
Okay, amazing. I'm going to ask if you don't mind to leave questions for the end, and we'll leave plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Yeah, so the title of my talk is Bylaws for Biodiversity. It's also the name of a project I'm going to be talking to you about. I've participated and contributed to the project, but it is much larger than me and has predated my time in the lab. I wanted to speak to you today about my lived experience advocating for bird habitat in my community of London, Ontario, and applying some of the teachings from this Bylaws for Biodiversity project. So really, this is about the intersection of these two parts of my world. This photo on the left actually shows my habitat garden in my front yard, a work in progress. So today, just to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about, I'll start with why make room for nature on private land. I imagine I'm largely preaching to the converted in this audience, but maybe I can teach you something new that's useful for your own advocacy work in your community. Talk about my experience in London, the project itself, Bylaws for Biodiversity, and then share some useful resources and tools. I love this picture of bumblebees visiting Jerusalem artichoke plant in my front yard. They always manage to share the flowers there. Um, so just sort of, I guess, elaborating on the land acknowledgement that Autumn gave at the beginning, I try and situate this work in a longer order of time, at least for me, where I live in London, which is in southwestern Ontario. There have been people here coexisting with nature for at least 12,000 years, according to the archaeological record. There are still Indigenous peoples in this region, in our urban centers, as well as in First Nations, downriver from London. Their names are the Attawandaron peoples, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples. This is one of the earliest maps of London, Ontario that I could find. You can see it's pretty quaint back in the day from the year 1795. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we are all treaty people living on lands that are subject to treaties in many cases. Um, I found this clause of a treaty that applies to London really interesting. I'll just read a quote from it. Thence down the said River Thames, which is the name of the river in English that flows through our region, following several winding and courses with the stream to the place of beginning, to have and to hold the said parcel or tract of land together with all the woods and waters thereon situate lying. So, as is widely understood today, when these treaties were signed by Indigenous peoples, there was a bit of a misunderstanding or miscommunication with the settlers as to what was actually meant by the language in these treaties. And when I look at this, to me, it speaks to an understanding at the time that, we're holding a piece of land together with the woods and waters on the land. Obviously, that is no longer what we see on the landscape today. In fact, if you were to go back in time a few hundred years, what you would likely see in the region where I live today is a lot of sprawling Carolinian forests like this, deciduous trees. We only have a few remnants of this left on the landscape. This is a photo I took at Bacchus Woods, which is managed by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, just south of London. Really a remarkable feature and something that we should acknowledge as part of the heritage of this entire region. It's not just forests that have been lost, though. We know that wetlands are also an imperiled category of ecosystems. And we actually have fewer wetlands left in Ontario, where I live, than what the federal government deems is necessary for a healthy watershed. We see crazy amounts of flooding happening, especially under climate change. And so there's been rapid conversion of natural land cover types to the built form, historically to agriculture, today to sprawling subdivisions. The southern parts of Canada, which is where most of the people live, is where we see the greatest biodiversity in Canada and also the greatest number of species at risk. These are just two maps showing concentrations of species at risk, as well as species richness overall. Of course, there are other ecosystems and many species living in northern ranges of Canada, but there's a lot of conservation concern for those species living in the southern part of the country. And of course, that's where you've got great overlap with human population centers. According to the most recent census data, this is where we have the greatest population increases. Southwestern Ontario is highlighted for having a lot of growth. There's central areas in different provinces where we see cities expanding. And so this overlaps quite a bit actually with the Bird Friendly Cities program that we're all participating in. There are more and more bird friendly cities and towns, communities joining this program every year. And they exist at this intersection of where you have fast population growth of people and also conservation concern for species that we coexist with. Just to kind of zoom in on the map, these are the bird-friendly cities and communities that exist in Ontario at the moment, or southwestern Ontario. I'm really proud to say that London is shown in gold on this map because we have achieved a high level of certification, not really because of me, but because of a lot of great work that has existed in London since before my time here, as well as programs and policies that are continuing. But this is just to show we are kind of in the middle of three Great Lakes in southwestern Ontario. um, we're surrounded by a lot of agricultural land and remnant green spaces. So protecting land for nature is understood today by the federal government and the international community as a priority. Canada is a signatory to the Global Biodiversity Framework as of a few years ago that committed us to protecting 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. And this applies throughout Canada. It's not just in the northern parts of Canada, it's also in the southern parts of Canada, given that we have that conservation interest down here. So just to sort of segue this into the Bird Friendly Cities program, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the certification. And under Section 2, there is quite a lot to say about habitat protection, restoration, and climate resiliency. So if you look at this section, there's a discussion about municipal lands. What are we doing to protect biodiversity, make landscapes more climate resilient on public property? And so that would be reflected in things like urban parkland. They have strategies for how they manage green spaces in cities. In London, we have an official plan, like in any other major city in Ontario. There's environmental policies laid out in the official plan that dictate to some extent what happens in the public realm. And so we have a lot of policies that are supporting biodiversity, ecological sustainability more broadly on public lands. But the public land piece is treated as separate from the private land piece. Most of the land in my community and in most cities in Canada is actually under private ownership. I can't really show you this in a map, but you're looking at the built up area of London, and almost all of that, where you've got buildings that you can see here, is privately owned. That doesn't apply to things like your public libraries and community centers, but it is including things like homes, institutional buildings, etc. And of those privately owned lots, really the vegetation communities are predominated still by monoculture turf grass lawns. If you were to zoom in on that map in many neighborhoods, you'd see lots that look like this. London has the benefit of being known as the forest city. We've got a fairly healthy urban canopy. It's a source of pride for our community. But that being said, we still have a lot of lawn, and that lawn tradition is really important to us. There has been more focus of late on kind of reforming our attitudes towards the lawn. There's a variety of authors that have published on the subject. Would recommend looking into that literature if you'd like to learn more. But this is a holdover really from a settler colonial tradition. And where better to discuss this than a town known as London, where we named the river that flows through here for millennia the Thames River. Really, lawns are a status symbol. They're a holdover of class dynamics dating back many centuries to feudalistic societies in Europe. And if you could own a castle like the one shown on the left, then you would want to showcase your wealth by having, sprawling manicured lawns that you would hire a lot of workers to control for you over time, really expressing human dominion over the landscape. It was a way of separating ourselves visually in terms of our aesthetic value from the natural world around us. I love this graphic that poses the question, like in terms of cultural change, if you don't dress like this anymore, if that's not your aesthetic or your vibe, then why do you still want your landscaping to look like it's centuries old? I think it's a good question. So moving to the private property, we've talked a little bit about the public realm. There is actually a criteria in the Bird Friendly Cities program to demonstrate widespread community participation in initiatives to encourage native plant habitat that supports native birds and pollinators on private property, to increase the urban tree canopy on private land, and to support other green infrastructure initiatives to address climate change. I love the way that this is worded because it's very broad. So there's a lot of different things that communities can do. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that work that's happened locally. My interest personally in this came from reading a book that was gifted to me a few years ago from an author who became a friend of mine, Lorraine Johnson, as well as Sheila Kala. Um, and I love this book so much because for the first time ever, I was able to understand the specific mutualist relationships between plants in my garden and beneficial insects. As in, we're all familiar with the monarch butterfly and milkweed plants. These kinds of plant insect relationships are really, really critical to ecosystem integrity. And this book lays it out in a really beautiful way to understand what actually you are feeding and attracting to your garden. And so I was inspired a few years ago learning about flooding to put in a rain garden in my front yard. Here's my partner and my grandmother toiling away in the soil, got their native plants ready to go. And this is a municipally supported program. So the funding for the rain garden program, which is administered by a nonprofit, comes from the city. I had to go through a whole process of a locate request and then digging a huge hole, which you can't really see here. But my point is, this native garden I planted was actually supported by the city. And when we talk about native landscaping and what it should look like, people think of it in kind of a romanticized way like this. This is desirable native flora, right? It's beautiful. Look at those lovely, flowers. You'll see bumblebees and butterflies visiting them. This is what my front yard now looks like in late summer. Those little plants I showed you in the previous slide have all grown up. But if you were to arrive here, a few months earlier, this is what you would see. Is that beautiful? I mean, maybe in the eye of the beholder. But if you arrive a little later, after the flowers are gone and it's gotten cold, this is what you would see. And I pose the question, is this too messy? Is it bad because it's not neat and tidy? I mean, again, I think that's at the crux of what we're talking about today is how do we change our expectations of what a garden is supposed to look like? You might see these cages around my property where I've put in young plantings. As I'll explain a little later, these were mistaken for garbage scattered throughout my yard. No, I assure you they are very, very important to the integrity of my plants for the reasons you see on the right. Um, those are my lawnmowers, essentially. And a lot of plants I've put in carefully over the years have just disappeared and become lunch. I don't begrudge them for it. They are part of the ecosystem, but that's why we put out these cages. Here's another thing you might see in my yard. Certain times of year, I leave the leaves, which we all probably understand is a beneficial practice for our urban soils. Many insects depend on leaf litter. You can see a nice bloodroot, native ephemeral plant poking through the leaf litter. On the left, you see my brush pile. This is right in front of my spice bush, which is a woodland plant. And I kept a brush pile back there to provide habitat to help restore the soil, essentially composting it in place. This is not considered within the norm of our conventional landscaping aesthetic, focusing on lawns. This is the sort of material that you're supposed to dutifully round up, put inside bags, bring to the curb every year, and get it out of sight because it's messy or unkept or dirty. And so after I set up my garden and I allow it to establish and I left the leaves and I did all the things I was learning were important for pollinators and birds, I got this ticket left on my front door. It says, please clear all grass and weeds exceeding 8 inches in height. And most people who receive these are alarmed, understandably. I actually wanted this. It was kind of a trap I had been setting carefully because I wanted to understand more about the applicable policies. My interest in this started when I learned about this case in London, where this poor woman had done a beautiful job creating a habitat garden specifically tailoring to the monarch butterfly. And while she was on vacation a few years ago in the summer, the city came, issued an order. She didn't receive it because she was away, and the entire garden was just razed to the ground, and she got fined. This is what it looked like before and after. And she was in shock. I mean, she was kind of traumatized by the experience. I felt quite bad for her. But at the time, I was involved with the local government in London, chairing an advisory committee that talks about environmental stewardship and climate action. And I started to get inquiries from the public. They were going, Brendon, what's the deal with this poor woman's garden, right? I want to grow native plants like you're telling me to, but am I going to get in trouble with the city? And so I became interested in this and I asked about it and was told, it's kind of legally confidential because it's her yard and an order was issued. We can't talk much about it. And so I said, well, if I were to get a ticket doing the same thing for my yard, like planting milkweed shown here for the monarch butterfly, then it would become my business. And so that brings us back to this order I received. This was now involving my property, and so I had to be informed about what was the issue here. So please clear all grass weeds in height, exceeding 8 inches in height. Let's examine that a little closer. So in my front yard, I planted this beautiful type of grass called Indian grass. You can see it next to me. I'm about 6 feet tall. This was in the late summer, and it grows a lot taller than 8 inches in height. I think in the right conditions, it might even grow to 8 feet in height. And the little yellow things you see are the seeds that come off of the plant, meaning it can't actually fulfill its life cycle until it gets to be quite tall. On the right, you can see my common milkweed, and on the underside of the leaf, there's a tiny little set of eggs, which I think were from a milkweed, monarch butterfly. Didn't actually get to follow up on that particular plant, but weed is in the name of the plant, right? It's a milkweed, just like my fireweed and my jewel weed, native species that are highly beneficial for the ecosystem. And so I wondered, is that a weed I have to cut down? And so I took this to City Hall, which I encourage people to do when you get something that you don't understand involving your local government. Ask questions about it. I informed myself about the relevant legal precedents for the conflict that I was perceiving, and there were quite a few of them actually. I'm not going to go through the details of all of these on this slide, but this has been a decided matter in various courts concerning other people's right to express themselves through the landscaping they choose on their private property. And it also has been ruled repeatedly what municipalities can and cannot do in terms of writing legislation and regulations. There are expectations that the language needs to be particular, it needs to be clear and reproducible in its enforcement. If the language is too vague to be interpreted and applied consistently, that can open up liability for a municipality. This is an example of one of the gardens that was included in a lawsuit from 1996. This was deemed at the time to be excessively too high. Okay, you can make of that what you will. So when I went to City Hall with my notice, I worked with my advisory committee to draft recommendations that went to City Council. The local media picked up on it, and I was happy to talk about it because ultimately this is really a social challenge we need to communicate about. And to no surprise, I got a lot of pushback. A lot of people were really upset. I mean, reading social media comments on local politics is generally pretty harrowing, but in this case, people got downright nasty. I had somebody come by and throw garbage at me while I was landscaping in front of my house. Um, it went on and on and on, and there were various articles about this. I mean, I had to laugh because I was just like, who are these people really? Like, this is my business. It's what I'm doing on my property. Why are you so upset about what I'm doing to express my values? I care about biodiversity in my community, with given all the benefits we know that native landscaping can provide. Um, to counteract all that negative pressure, though, we rallied the community in a really positive way. So we had a letter to City Council that received over 200 signatures in support of taking a look at this bylaw and trying to modernize it to be more permissive of native landscaping. We had a public participation meeting where people got to show up and contribute their insights. One thing I did that was kind of fun is I collected seeds and I packaged them into clay and seed balls, and I gifted one to each of the city councilors and each of the staff. I had an insider help me put one of these on each desk at the meeting where this was being discussed. And lo and behold, after several months of back and forth, the bylaw was updated. It was made much more permissive. And this has been a really positive experience for me and my community. To clarify, what the bylaw has done is it's made it so that really it's regulating matters to do with health and safety and public nuisance, not aesthetics. If you want to naturalize your property, you no longer have to get a ticket and then apply for an exemption. It's allowed by default. They clarify that the height limit for grass only applies to turf grass, as in lawns. They defined weeds as specific prohibited plants. And to accompany this bylaw reform, the city invested in public education and communications. So if you visit the city's website, and I'm happy to share the link afterwards, you'll see that the page for this bylaw that a complainant might encounter if they were worried about a particular property clarifies that this now aligns with the Climate Emergency Action Plan, that we are encouraging people to maintain diverse, resilient native plant species, and that the bylaw does not manage aesthetics. It's not about what you find beautiful or ugly or messy. It's really about health and safety. And so if you visit the website, you'll see detailed recommendations of what you must do, what you can't do, um, and clarifying naturalized yards are indeed permitted. Um, so if you choose to do this, something you need to keep in mind is that your grass still needs to be cut. If you have areas of your property that are lawn, you can't just let it grow indefinitely. Importantly, for health and safety, at the corners of the property by a boulevard or a sidewalk, there's a triangle, and you are not allowed to let vegetation grow higher than 3 feet in height. Um, in those areas so that when people are backing out of a driveway or turning a corner, their sight lines are maintained. And that's really important for pedestrian and driver safety, that visibility component. They also listed specific prohibited plants that are not allowed in naturalized gardens. So whereas before it just said no weeds, now it actually says these are the specific plants that are not allowed. Common buckthorn, for example, is a really problematic shrub that spreads like crazy and outcompetes native vegetation. You probably recognize some of the others here. Poison ivy is another one that, despite being native, is regulated in cities because it's a noxious weed and it can cause harm if people come into contact with it. There are certain plants that need to be regulated and restricted in certain settings. For example, this is ragweed. So this is a highly allergenic plant. This was a photo I took in a schoolyard of, I guess, a former garden bed that was neglected, covered in ragweed. So this is actually a health concern, and this is a situation where it would be appropriate to call the city regarding the property standards and let them know that this is not in compliance. Important to note that in Ontario and in other provinces and territories, there are provincially regulated species that are considered noxious weeds. So all of these as well mostly are listed here because they're agricultural weeds, but these are not weeds that you would want to have growing on your property. And this is just showing a visualization of the sightlines concept I was telling you about. This is actually a graphic from the city of Guelph that has similar standards in place. You can see that where on either side of the driveway, depending on whether there's a boulevard and sidewalk or just a boulevard, where the triangle would fit, in that gray triangle, the vegetation needs to be kept below 3 feet in height. And we recommend planting low-growing native species in that area so that you're never going to need to trim them. They're just going to stay short. I'm in the process of growing out strawberries all along the curb in front of my house. It's a work in progress. So on the education piece, something that we wanted to do was to actually incentivize people to do this, make it something to celebrate and be proud of. And so we got support from the city to print these signs that I've distributed to around 80 households across the city. People usually display them at the boulevard so that their neighbors and passersby can see them. It links to the website that I just showed you with all that information about naturalization. And now the ticket that I got sits proudly on my wall. It's a limited edition print, and it's a really good story for my house guests. So I want to share some lessons learned in doing this advocacy because I know in hindsight it seems really easy and I make it all seem like it's done and dealt with. This is an iterative process. It's going to look different in every community and it's challenging. It's a lot of emotional labor, to be honest. So I'm going to speak a little bit from my lived experience doing this kind of advocacy. Really important to know who your allies are. So talking for your own property with your neighbors in advance of what you're trying to do, make sure that they're understanding that you're not just neglecting your property. But if you actually want to advocate for bylaw reform, engage with your local community groups, like your nature clubs, birding groups. Elected officials have a big say on what happens when it comes time to review a bylaw. And so shown here are two that were really strong supporters. Sam Troso is a retired professor from the university who's actually a lawyer, very interested in charter-based challenges of law. And when he learned of what we were doing, he went throughout his ward to all the properties that were naturalizing their gardens and showing, is this a problem? Is this health or safety? And he had a really good time. I like this photo because he's kind of dressed like a bumblebee. Yeah, he put himself out there in a really positive way. Skylar Frank, former member of our local bird team, she's now a city councilor. She ran for government office because she wanted to make the world better and deal with the climate crisis for her son, Rory. So we go bird watching together all the time. And she was a really strong advocate internally for the changes we were trying to bring forward. We also engaged with the municipal staff, the people who work in municipal bylaw compliance, the people that do bylaw research, to share our concerns and understand what they were coming up against internally. So in doing that kind of engagement, having those conversations with people on the inside of these systems you're trying to change, it's beneficial to try and find common ground. You might come out and say, here are things that are important to me. But if it doesn't align with their values, then you might not actually be having the same conversation. So, for example, in our initial engagement, we learned that a really big challenge for the city is that the bylaw enforcement is hugely expensive. They get tons and tons and tons of complaints about property standards. Often it's more than they can keep up with. And so we pitched this as actually a way of reducing cost, that if they were to make it easier, clearer for people to achieve compliance with the bylaw, then they wouldn't have to be going after people that are trying to do the right thing for climate and biodiversity because there was a stronger mutual understanding and it would reduce the volume of complaints about those properties. Another thing I learned is that when you're talking to people about what you're doing with your private property, they might see a mess and not understand that you're actually expressing your values through what you're doing with your landscaping. As in, those people might care a lot about freedom of speech. That's actually protected by the same law that protects what I'm doing with my landscaping in front of my house. So clarifying that legal context for them can help bring people on side. And finally, and I stressed this earlier, naturalization is not the same thing as neglecting a yard. So when we brought this reform forward, we explained very clearly to the politicians and to the public, you can't just leave your landscaping alone and pretend it's going to work itself out. If you have turf grass lawn, the expectation remains that you don't allow that to exceed 8 inches in height. Um, Also, understanding that if you're transitioning away from a lawn to another form of landscaping, that process happens incrementally. You might not be able to do the entire thing at once.
Oh no. I think we just may have lost Brendan. Give him a moment here. I do know that. Oh,
You're going to attract ticks. You're going to attract vermin. There's going to be mice and share in a moment a resource that can help you dispel some of these fears so that people can understand the magnitude of their concern relative to what's actually happening on the ground. I would argue, for instance, that we should be a lot more concerned about neglected garbage disposal and people overfeeding wildlife, like allowing birdseed to be dumped on the ground, than we should be about native plants. And goldenrod is not going to trigger people's allergies. Again, ragweed, the plant I showed you earlier, is much more concerning, albeit not as visible as the goldenrod. I also learned in talking to members of the community, including people that signed on to that petition letter, that a lot of folks were really intimidated by this bylaw business. At the time, they were worried that someone could just complain about them and they could get a ticket, they could get into a legal quandary with the city, and that was causing a chilling effect where we were concerned that people were not going to engage with the type of landscaping changes we were promoting because they were worried about getting in trouble. These bylaws are enforced on a complaint-driven basis, and that mechanism of complaints can be weaponized against neighbors because the complainant is protected. They submit the complaint under anonymity, and they don't really have to provide much substantial evidence to support their complaint for the city to send a couple of bylaw officers out in a truck to inspect a property and potentially issue an order. Um, we've made a lot of changes in London that have remedied this, I would say, to great satisfaction. But this is some of the cultural context for why we wanted to motivate bylaw reform. And finally, and this is a nice bridge into the next part of my talk, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you want to do what I did in London with others in my community, or if you want to maybe start this in your community, look to other communities, other cities and towns and counties that have essentially already done this. And so the Ecological Design Lab, which I'm now a part of at Toronto Metropolitan University, has this long-standing project called Bylaws for Biodiversity. And it really pulls together a lot of resources that have been developed as part of the advocacy that led to the changes in the jurisdictions I'm showing on this slide. So very briefly, I'm a postdoctoral fellow now in the Ecological Design Lab. This is really all about connecting people and nature in cities. And there's sort of three pillars of the lab, focusing on landscape connectivity, which is what I now study in an urban context, developing really effective green and blue infrastructure, and then making cities more resilient to nature loss and climate change. Very briefly, we know that combinations of blue and green infrastructure can really be a boon for urban biodiversity. These are nature positive solutions that also help with things like flooding and overheating. We can hold slow, and clean the water using our landscaping. And we can also create well-connected, protected habitats on private property. This is, again, showing you that lawn that was deemed too tall. And I'm showing this again because it's been established through the courts that the owner of this property has a legal right to express their values through the landscaping that they chose for the property, barring matters of health and safety. So, for example, you can see that fire hydrant there. If she had crazy tall plants growing in front of the fire hydrant, arguably that would be a safety concern. Not the case here. And so, despite this being set in precedent through case law, there's still code enforcement happening across the country. There's still some ongoing residual conflicts in the city of Toronto, despite having their bylaw been updated, as well as in communities that haven't really looked at this yet. And so one of the things that this lab has focused on through the Bylaws for Biodiversity project is the way that municipal codes and bylaws can act as a barrier to biodiversity on private land. This is showing the former grass and weeds bylaw from the city of Toronto. And this information will all be made available afterwards through the website that I'll share in the chat. There's been detailed legal analysis of these bylaws and the problems with them and the liabilities that introduces for municipalities, such as the use of really vague terms without definitions, grass, weeds, plants, vermin, things I've already talked about. That things can be really subjective and left up to the interpretation of individual law enforcement officers, meaning that these things can be arbitrary and not enforced consistently. That opens up a municipality to being challenged in court. Finally, if the bylaw is regulating aesthetics and it's telling people what they can and cannot express in terms of their values under the charter, that could be deemed unconstitutional. And indeed, that has been found in court. My new supervisor, Nina Marie Lister, and the director of the Ecological Design Lab has had great success advocating for this issue in the city of Toronto. I would call her instrumental in reforming the city's bylaw. She even had the mayor, John Tory, over to visit her habitat garden. This was really about being inclusive and bringing people in to understand the story and the motivation behind the work that was being done by people on the front lines of the climate crisis. And so if you visit the Ecological Design Lab website, which will be linked in the chat, there's a wide variety of resources that I would encourage you to take a look at if you're interested in doing this kind of advocacy. We have really spelled this out, I'd say, in a very constructive way that is meant for people ranging from community advocates to law enforcement officers to public officials to be able to pick up and apply in your local jurisdictional context. So I'm just going to flip through some slides quickly showing you the examples of the materials that we've got. There's a model bylaw, which is quite useful, a variety of resources, legal analyses and things included under the Bylaws for Biodiversity project. Just to give you a sense of what these pages look like, detailed case studies of what has transpired that has led to bylaw reform in other jurisdictions. Here's the title page for the model bylaw. So if your community is interested in starting this up, again, you don't have to do it from scratch. This model bylaw is loosely adapted from Prince Edward County, applied in the city of Toronto. I used it in London. This is really, really a good roadmap for how you can design a good, effective policy that will also protect the public interest. We've got some reports. So this is a fun one I was involved with called Collaborative Toolkit for Municipalities. This is meant for once you've actually established a connection with your city or town and you're talking to staff, here's what to do. Here's how to structure those conversations, the kinds of information you might want to look for so that people are contributing and we're actually designing policy in an evidence-based way. Some key points from the research we did as part of generating that report, that we found a disparity between public policy for private and public property. As in we were promoting biodiversity and climate change in parklands and city assets, not so much on private land through things like property standards bylaws. That there is some mention for naturalized gardens in existing property standards bylaws, such as allowing people to apply for exemptions to those bylaws, but these systems generally favor the complainant. As in, if you see a yard that's messy, you can call it in, and regardless of whether that bylaw is in compliance, that yard is in compliance with the bylaw or not, the municipality will still follow up and potentially trigger a site inspection. There are these fines that have been issued in other jurisdictions that are kind of disproportionate to the magnitude of what would be called a crime. Again, these have been challenged as well. And so, as you're designing a bylaw, some things to think about are agency and enforcement action versus the structure of the bylaw. A lot is left up to the subjective interpretation of law enforcement officers on the ground. So, we want to make sure that the bylaw is really, really clear for them to understand what is and is not permitted. There needs to be fairness and due process. Where if you are a defendant, like someone like me that has received a complaint against your yard and there's an order left on your door, what is my recourse, right? How can I contest that? How can I go back to the city and explain what I'm doing? That process needs to be clarified as part of bylaw reform. Um, I advocate, and I believe the project does as well, for intervening at the source. So during the complaint intake, as in if somebody's calling to complain about a property, we should try and find out more information from them before we determine if that's a valid complaint. As in, are you complaining just because you don't like how this looks? When you say there's vermin, do you have any evidence of that? That's the sort of detail that I think can inform the subsequent steps and investments in municipal resources. And so finally, it's about not just the bylaw design, but also the intent. Just like the City of London put on their website, this is meant to deal with health safety, not aesthetics. A few other resources just for your information. We did a detailed policy scan and analysis and provided detailed recommendations for improving the enforcement process. Um, and these tools might be of interest for public education as well. There's a variety of papers included in this Gardening for Biodiversity project, including a how-to guide if you want to start naturalizing a property, myths and misconceptions to do with things I've talked about, like ticks, mice, rats, and other pests. I contributed to one on bird-friendly gardens, so how we can support bird habitat in every season. And then top plant picks and underrated practices for a healthy habitat garden. We also have free downloadable signs. There's a variety of these available now from the Canadian Wildlife Federation, pollinator programs across the country. These ones are freely available to download and reproduce on the website if you are interested, again, to help with signaling that intentionality behind your landscaping choices. And so just to wrap things together, our recommendations are we need to normalize naturalized biodiversity, recognizing that that term is kind of, you know, tricky for people to interpret because this is very much an artificial practice. It's something that people are doing. They're changing landscaping using native species towards a more natural aesthetic. But when we use the term naturalized, we are including people as part of nature. We need to remove turf grass norms and have help shift expectations that we should just have lawn everywhere. We need to modify our height restrictions, especially vis-a-vis native grasses and so-called weeds, and really restrict the control of these features to ecological, human health, and safety, not subjective interpretation about aesthetics. It's very important when these bylaw reforms are being enacted that we consult widely and deeply, especially with Indigenous community members, because there are plants that might be of cultural value to those people, and we don't want to unintentionally create a conflict with that culture by restricting the presence of those plants. Ensuring that really, like I talked about, the burden of proof is on complainants. To me, I hope the links in